Hi, my name is Matthew Higgs. I'm the director of White Columns in New York, and behind me are works by the great Bay Area-based artist Dan Miller. Dan Miller is an artist who is associated with the Creative Growth Arts Center in Oakland, and Dan's worked at Creative Growth for many years, more than 25 years. Dan's largely non-verbal, and I think this is important when we start to think about the drawings that Dan makes. And Dan makes these extraordinary drawings that initially appear to be abstract, but for the most part they're not. For the most part they're drawings of language, words, written on top of each other until they become kind of obscured, almost kind of like a cloud. And a drawing like this would be a kind of almost typical early drawing by Dan. It's still a medium and a form that he works in, where you get these extraordinarily dense clusters of lines and mark making, of words written upon words. Whereas I said before, you get the sense that it almost becomes like a cloud, and it makes me think at least of a sort of very famous drawing by Robert Smithson called A Heap of Language, where it's just a pile of words. And you get a sort of similar disorientating effect here, where language no longer becomes about certainty or clarity. Language becomes much more kind of pliable, elastic, and porous. Sometimes you can start to see the structure of the language and the structure of the way that Dan makes a drawing. You see the word on, you see the word strip, and a lot of the works relate to electricity, to light sources, to power, and it's a kind of constant part of Dan's drawing practice. And I think, as far as I understand, it relates to his family having once owned a hardware store. So a lot of the reference in his work seem to relate back to this earlier experience in his life, when he was surrounded by these things and these objects. Dan works every day, I think, at Creative Growth Studio in Oakland. If you're ever in Oakland, I'd encourage you to visit it. It's one of the most important centers nationally and internationally for artists with disabilities. And Dan is an extraordinary prolific artist. He works every day on these drawings, and the process of watching him work, or the process of watching a white sheet get transformed through this accumulation of languages and words, drawing and mark making, is really an extraordinary thing to behold. Another great way to work in the current show at Andrew Edlin is this sculptural piece by Judith Scott. And I think it's worth mentioning that Judith Scott was also an artist associated with Creative Growth in Oakland, and she would have been there concurrently with Dan Miller for some of that time. So they would have worked in the same space, shared often a kind of peripheral relationship to each other's art production, and I think there's a lot of commonalities or shared interests in their work. Very typical of Judith's work is taking a found object, in this case a baseball bat, which she then wrapped with found fabrics and twine. And this sort of act of concealment is pretty much central to Judith's sculptural practice. Judith was non-verbal, and like Dan, she was explicitly using, I think, art-making practice or sculptural practice as a way to communicate directly with other people and the people around her at Creative Growth Studio. Both artists have become really quite well known, and I think deservedly so, because the work they make is extraordinary. Dan's work has been the subject of many exhibitions internationally, including at Andrew Edlin Gallery and also at White Columns, where I work. And Judith's work was the subject of a retrospective at the Brooklyn Museum that was curated by myself and Catherine Morris from the Sackler Center for Feminist Art. So I'd encourage you to look into both artists' work. It's Dan Miller and Judith Scott, and both works can be, artists' work can currently be seen at the Andrew Edlin Gallery in New York.